afternoon, everybody. Thanks for being here, and welcome to the last CPEP seminar for this spring 2026 semester. It's been a really nice semester full of some great presentations, and I'm sure that's going to continue through today also. Today I have the pleasure of introducing Yakun Zhang for our presentation. Yakun is a relatively new hire here at UW-Madison through the RISE AI initiative. And her department is in soil and environmental sciences. Prior to coming to UW-Madison, Yakun was at Oregon State University for a few years as an assistant professor there. And before that, actually received her degree in soil science from University of Wisconsin-Madison here. And then also received a degree prior to that from McGill University. And so a lot of her research really does focus on agricultural and soil sciences, and particularly the use of AI information and information in developing those processes and doing those analyses. So with that, I think I'll turn it over to you today. Thank you for being here, even though I know you don't feel your best. So we appreciate that you're going to still make this effort for us. So thank you very much.
Thank you for the introduction. So I unfortunately got sick since last Friday, but I will try my best to complete today's presentation. So today's presentation, I will talk about some of my past research and ongoing projects related to soil science, new technologies, and lots of modeling approaches. So I want to start with a little bit of background about what we study in soil science and why I study them, because this is a very different group, and many of you are not familiar with what we do in soils. So soil is very essential for life on Earth. It provides us the engineering medium, and it also supports the food security, carbon storage, water nutrient cycling, and also ecosystem resilience. And we consider soil is very slow to form. Generally, it takes about 1,000 years to create 1 inch of topsoil, but it can be easily lost because of different levels of disturbance. And therefore, we consider soil as a non-renewable resource at the human time scale. And however, the soil degradation has become a global threat. So this figure I like a lot. It represents how the soil is formed from the initial unweathered rock. As you can see here, we have the unweathered rock. And because of different external factors such as climate, organism, relief, material, and time, after thousands or hundreds of years, we have the current soil that we see today with multiple layers. So although we observe or study soil at its current status, it actually carries accumulative outcomes of the historical climate events and land use changes. And especially in the past century and a few decades, the land use change, soil erosion, and different management practices have changed a lot for the soil resources. And this is an example that quantified the land use change between 2001 and 2012 and how the soils are lost and gained because of the land use changes. And here's a more straightforward picture of the soil differences among different land use types. So the soils were dug in Central Sands, Wisconsin, and they are very close to each other, within 10-meter distance. And you can see, so here you can, that's the soil surface that's roughly 1 meter deep. And you can see at the surface between 0 to 25 centimeters, we have the dark material. That's organic matter-rich layer, and we call it topsoil. And so you can see with the decades of agricultural intensification, it just accumulates with lots of topsoil in this agricultural field compared to other forests and nearby forests and grasslands. And also, agricultural intensification created a sharp layer between the surface and subsurface. So that's just a straightforward impact of how the land use change affected soil properties and how we observe it. And we also quantify lots of properties, and they are just very different for different land use types. There are some issues with the monitoring of soils. It's actually very difficult to monitor because of the high spatial, vertical, and temporal variability. So if we look at the one-dimensional from surface to deeper part of the landscape, the soil varies greatly. And then it also varies two-dimensional and three-dimensional at the landscape. This is an 11-hectare agricultural field, and I plotted the bulk density distribution across the landscape and also with depths. It shows the bulk density varied from 0.1 to about 1.7. And if we look at the temporal scale, some soil properties change significantly too. This is a moisture concentration of the soil. And here's the time, and you can see how rapidly it changes with the time. So why it's difficult to monitor is not only because of the spatial temporal variability, there's also lots of constraints in terms of the measurements. It's very time-consuming to collect samples and to conduct lab experiments or lab testing. And also, once you collect samples, it's difficult to go back again and to collect new samples to monitor its change because it's already disturbed. And then we also want to use remote sensing to monitor soil changes because we can use remote sensing to monitor many changes on Earth, like the vegetation growing and urbanization and other changes. But soil is covered by lots of stuff, like the vegetation, buildings, and others. It's very difficult to monitor or to go through those materials before you reach the soil. However, there are lots of new data streams that make the soil easily to monitor and to help us raise the memory. So there are lots of archive soil data. This is an example from USDA and NRCS. They collected over 30,000 soil profiles across the US. And the data can go back to 1950. Then we also have other more easily available data sources, such as the elevation data and terrain attributes, climate variables that cover spectral data, proximal and remote sensing. And with the modeling approaches, including geostatistics, machine learning, AI models, it makes it easier to monitor the soil properties spatially, temporally. So the goal of my research program, or the research we do, is mostly using big data, machine learning to help us read the soil archive, understand their ecosystem memory, and build scalable tools for soil monitoring. Then I will use several case studies to show what we have done before. So the first case study is related to soil organic carbon change in Wisconsin over 150 years. And the second is a national scale study about a rapidly more stable property is a thickness, the topsoil and soil thickness across the US. And then the third one is related to topsoil thickness and its ecosystem effects. And then I will showcase some of my current work and ongoing projects. Okay. Let's start with the local study, the organic carbon change in Wisconsin. So this map just shows the spatial variability of soil organic matter across the US. And organic matter is determined by the input and output. Basically, if you have more vegetation, you have more organic matter input. And if you are in hot and humid regions, the microbial activities are very strong. Then they decompose a lot of the organic matter, and then you lose lots of organic matter. So this balance determines how much organic matter you have in the soil. But it varies spatially. Then this is a study that determines how the organic matter has been changed with the time. So as you can see, we have the change of the croplands. The reddish color represents the cropland accumulation. It's just changed dramatically for the past 200 years. And then we also have the grazing lands. It also increased significantly for the past 100 or even 200 years. And correspondingly, this caused significant soil carbon loss. And based on their calculation, due to agricultural activities, the soil lost about 133 grams of carbon for the top 2 meters, and especially within the past 200 years. So in this study, we were trying to answer two questions. Can we reconstruct long-term soil carbon change when direct repeated measurements are limited? And how did soil organic carbon change due to climate change and land use change in Wisconsin? So we used the RCAP samples from the USDA and RCS. There are about 550 soil profiles with the carbon stock data. These samples were collected from 1980 to 2002 across the state. And this map shows the sample distribution across the state. And we also used historical land cover data and climate variables, terrain attributes. And then we developed a random forest model for the space for time substitution, and the model performance is shown here too. So before we look at carbon change, let's take a look at the land cover change. So this map shows the land use of 1850. You can see the green represents the forested land. So the state is just covered by the green for most parts in the past. And then in 1938, lots of the forest has been converted to croplands, represented by the red, and then the pasture, represented by the grayish color. And then this pattern basically maintains for the 1980 and 2002. And if you want to see some numbers, you can see the forest decreased from 79% to 41%. And then the grassland decreased from 7% to 1%. The cropland increased by 26%, pasture increased by 25%. And slash reforestation happened in this time period. And we also quantified the climate variability over the 150-year time period. And this shows the annual temperature, including the minimum temperature and maximum temperature. You can see it's relatively constant from the 1850 to 1980. And then it just increased significantly for the past 22 years. This map shows the precipitation change. It increased from about 850 to about 950 until 2002. From the random forest model, we generated the soil organic carbon maps, and we just selected the 4 time periods to show like how the carbon has been changed for the past 150 years. We have the initial map from the 1850, and actually the maps look quite similar, but there are some small scale patterns that are different. Generally, if you look at the spatial pattern, the highest carbon stock is located in the east and north of Wisconsin. So higher organic carbon concentrate stock is represented by the bluish color. So here you have higher carbon stock, and north in the forest land we have lots of carbon accumulated. And the reddish color represents lower carbon stock. So you can see in central sense, definitely we have lower carbon stock. And if you look at the temporal change, we can see for this region, the bluish pattern just decreased because we lost lots of carbon due to the land use change in this time period. We also quantified the uncertainty of the maps. So the red represents higher uncertainty. So for higher organic carbon stock regions, we have higher uncertainties. We generated the maps. Then we also calculated the rate of the change, and then the percent projected natural vegetation of soil organic matter. So for the rate of change, we just used the second map to minus the previous map, and we got the rate of change between the 1850 to 1938. And if the color is reddish or yellowish, it means we lost carbon during this time period. So you can see due to the land use change, we actually lost lots of carbon across the whole state, and mostly happened in this region, the eastern part. And then during this time period from 1938 to 1980 is relatively constant. and slightly carbon gain. And then in the 1980 to 2002, most of part of the state we increased the carbon, but for some part the carbon has been decreased. And to calculate the percent projected natural vegetation soil carbon, we use the maps to divide it by the natural vegetation status. So we consider the year 1850 as the status of the natural vegetation. And then compared with the 1850, if this value is smaller than 100%, we lost lots of carbon. However, if this value is greater than 100%, we gain lots of carbon. So it tells us the same story. During this time period from 1850 to 1938, we just lost of carbon across the state. However, due to the reforestation and some other activities, we just increased carbon in many parts of the state. Then we calculated the average value. So again, the 1850 is our baseline status, is 100%. And we decreased loss of carbon due to the land use change through the time period. And but eventually, the carbon has been increased slightly. And we also compared this with the nitrogen fertilizer use. So these points represent the natural fertilizer use for the past few decades. The explanation for the increase of carbon between the 1938 and the 89 is there are several reasons. The increased atmospheric temperature and CO2, so this increased the vegetation growth. So the carbon input has been increased because of the temperature and CO2 change. And then the irrigation management increased the productivity of the crops. This also increased the carbon input into the soil. And then the inputs of nitrogen fertilizers increased the productivity and the carbon input to the soil. And then the adoption of best management practices. So this stops the loss of carbon. The take-home message from this study, first, the machine learning can combine legacy soil observations with historical environmental data to reconstruct long-term soil carbon memory. And then the land cover change caused long-term carbon loss. Then the improved management contributed to some of the recovery of the carbon in the soil. Now let's move to a very different property, soil thickness, and also look at a larger scale, its spatial temporal changes. So if you have seen a similar figure related to this. So from the initial bedrock, first the rock needs to be disintegrated into smaller particles, and then there's organic matter accumulation from the plants and microbes, and eventually we have the soil that we observe today with multiple layers. And this is considered as the thickness of the soil from the surface to roughly here. There are actually different definitions of soil thickness, I will explain later. And soil thickness is also controlled by several factors, the input and output. The input is mainly from the soil formation and weathering from the bedrock. Basically, the bedrock is weathering and contributes lots of mineral materials and to build up the soil. And then the erosion removes the soil from the surface. There's also, if you're at lower landscape, there's also deposition from upper to increase the thickness of the soil. So why is thickness important? Because it controls the rooting volume, water storage, nutrient supply, carbon storage, and hydrological buffering. It is also very simplified in Earth system models, even though real soils vary strongly across the landscape. So there are two questions we want to answer in this study. If SOC is a biogeochemical memory, is soil thickness a physical or structural memory? And what controls the topsoil and soil thickness across the US? So there are two concepts here. The topsoil thickness, so basically if you still remember the soil image that I showed from the central sense of the cropland, forest, and grassland, we have the dark layer as the surface. They have higher organic matter concentration and more nutrients, more microbial activities. These are called A horizon or topsoil. So the thickness of the topsoil is just the thickness here. And then we also have the soil thickness, which includes the A horizon plus B horizon. So that's basically here. And they tell us different information. Here we use a legacy dataset from USDA. They collected lots of soil samples and did lots of field observation. Based on the field observation, we compiled the topsoil and soil thickness dataset. So across the continental US, we have over 37,000 samples, and for the topsoil. And for the whole soil profile or the soil thickness, we have about 22,000 samples. And that's another issue, as I mentioned, samples were not collected repeatedly from the same location, because once you collect samples from that location, it's actually deserved. You cannot go back to collect the same samples again. And also, the USDA tried to have good spatial coverage of the sampling locations, so they just don't want to go back to the same location to collect samples. So there's some systematic bias with the sampling design that USDA used. So let's take a look at the maps. This represents the topsoil thickness. The reddish color represents shallower topsoil, and then the bluish color represents the deeper topsoil. And we can see the desert regions in the southwestern part has relatively shallow topsoil. And then for our Great Lake regions, for the forested area in northern Wisconsin, Minnesota, and Michigan, we have shallower topsoils. Then if we look at the Midwest region, generally the soils are deep because they are very fertile and good for agricultural production. And if we look at the West Coast, there are also lots of deeper topsoils. Then if we look at the soil thickness, again, for the drier regions, the soils are generally shallower for the whole profile. But the different pattern is observed here. For the southeastern US, the soil thickness is relatively deep. And another pattern I forgot to mention is here. Can you see this like a vertical pattern? That's basically along the Mississippi River. And that's general national scale pattern. But another issue with the thickness data is there are lots of local scale variability that are difficult to quantify and capture through lots of the models. And then we also plotted the distribution of the samples collected from different years. You can see it's not a balanced sampling design. For certain years, they collected a lot more samples. And actually, more samples were collected from croplands instead of forest or other land use types. And then there's also a distribution issue with the thickness data because they're highly skewed. Lots of soils have shallower topsoil and shallower soil, but some profiles have deeper topsoil, but very few of them. Then we also collected lots of environmental variables, including topography, climate, land cover, hair material, and developed a generalized additive model to study their relationships. That's the model structure. So this is, for this figure, we averaged the topsoil thickness and soil thickness for every degree along the longitude and every degree along the latitude. So you can see here, that's the topsoil thickness from western part of the US to the eastern part of the US. That's average data for each degree. So you can see along the longitude, the thickness decreased first. This is basically the desert region. and also the Rocky Mountain regions. And then it increased in the central parts. This is basically the Midwest region, the fertile soils. And then it decreased again and increased again along the East Coast. We also plotted the average elevation data, and it just shows the opposite pattern compared to the topsoil thickness. So this is where the Rocky Mountain is. Then we plotted the soil moisture pattern from west to east, and we found a very similar pattern compared to the topsoil thickness transition. We also calculated the Pearson correlations with the soil moisture data and also precipitation and some other moisture data. They have relatively strong correlations, 0.47 to 0.49. And we also evaluated the relationship with temperature. But for the topsoil thickness, it doesn't show any relationship with the temperature. And then we evaluated the pattern for the soil thickness. For the western part of the US, it shows similar patterns to the topsoil. West Coast has high thickness or deeper soil. It decreased to the desert region and also the Rocky Mountain regions here. Then it increased to the east, and then decreased again to the East Coast. And this pattern is similar to the elevation, but not as strong as the topsoil thickness. Then we plotted the minimum temperature. Probably we plotted maximum temperature too. But then the temperature shows a better match with the soil thickness pattern compared to the soil moisture data. The correlation is actually very strong, 0.63 to 0.74. So along the latitudes, the pattern is not that clear, and I have more explanations in the paper. But generally, the temperature negatively correlated with the topsoil thickness, but positively correlated with the soil thickness along the latitudes. But generally, for a soil thickness, no matter topsoil thickness or soil thickness, the pattern is stronger along the longitudinal pattern. Then we developed lots of GAN models to evaluate the specific control of individual environmental factors on the topsoil thickness and soil thickness. We also split the US into several land resource regions and developed the models in each of the regions to look at their local contributions. But we don't have time to discuss all the details today. This is just an example of how the different environmental factors contribute to the topsoil thickness. So thickness decreased exponentially with the slope until the 30 degrees. Then the model coefficients can tell us the positive or negative contribution of each environmental factor. So the vertical line, the red dashed line, represents 0. If the points are on the right of this vertical line, it tells us this factor contributes positively to the thickness. If the point is located on the left, it tells us they have negative contributions. So the molly soils, which are very fertile soils in the Midwest, have a thicker topsoil. So the molly soil is here. So it's highly positively contributed to the topsoil thickness. And then the soil was also deeper in hot regions, while the topsoil was thicker in moderate temperate regions. So in drier regions, the topsoil and the soil thickness were thinner. Well, that just tells us the spatial variability of the thickness. Then we wanted to study the temporal change of the thickness. But the thickness data is very difficult to process because the data were not repeated and continuously collected from the same locations across time. So we cannot create a time series data to analyze. And then we have to use the spatial data that were collected from different times to infer the temporal trends. So we created lots of chronal sequences within each land resource regions by controlling the other environmental factors constant. So for some regions, we just didn't have enough data to create the chronal sequences. So only the colored regions have the chronal sequences, and these are the locations to create the chronal sequences. Then we calculated the change of the thickness with the time, and the coefficient E was considered as the temporal change rate. Then we plotted the change for the topsoil and soil with their confidence intervals. So the brownish color represents the negative value, and it means we lost topsoil in this region. Then the bluish color represents positive value. It means we gained some topsoil in this region. And then the figure on the right represents the whole soil profile or the soil thickness. Then we found that temporal changes in the thickness varied across land resource regions affected by topography, land use, and erosion. The severe topsoil loss primarily occurred in mollisols in the central Great Plain and alphasols on the steep slopes and soils under cropping and cropland uses. So you can see the brownish color are basically located here, and we lost lots of topsoils in those regions. And the take-home message from this study, the climatic variables regulated soil thickness at the national scale, in which moisture was associated with the formation of the A horizon, while the temperature was mostly associated with the development of the soil. And then the land use and erosional processes contributed to the temporal variation of soil thickness. And soil thickness basically integrates long-term formation and short-term human disturbance. So it's a product of the history of the ecosystem processes, but it's also a constraint on future ecosystem function. So that's what I will present for my next study. And we have seen that soil thickness varies spatially and changes temporally due to management, human activities, or cropping. Now I want to show why it matters. So this basically explains the functional consequences of the topsoil thickness. This is a landscape scale picture. So again, we have a darker color for the surface. These are topsoil thickness. And if we go to the lower part of the landscape, we have more topsoil accumulation because of the erosional activities. The soils can be moved from the upper part to the lower part. And if you go to the steep areas or the upper part of the landscape, the topsoil thickness is shallower. And this different thickness accumulation affects the vegetation growth. You can see the crops are bigger here and smaller here. And this is another aerial photos. And this is an aerial photo from southern Iowa. Not sure, can you see it clearly from the back? We have very interesting patterns in these agricultural fields. Lots of dark areas and some light-colored regions. Actually, the soil color can be easily reflected from the aerial photo if there's no crop or vegetation on top of the soil. So this darker color represents the fertile topsoil, and then this light colored pattern just represents where the erosion happens. Lots of the topsoils have been moved or removed to the lower part of the landscape due to tillage activities. And you can see a huge variability happen in this field, also in these regions as well. So for this,
Where did you say the tillage?
Where?
Where is the tillage?
Oh, in Iowa, southern Iowa.
Iowa.
Yeah. And there's also the link, and you can go to the report or the article. So for this study, we try to answer two questions. Does deeper topsoil increase the productivity and resilience of the crops? Not only crops, vegetation. And does soil memory matter for ecosystem functioning under the climate stress? So we quantified the topsoil depth and then the gross primary productivity relationship in different scenarios. First is this relationship in different ecosystems, especially the natural ecosystem compared to managed ecosystem. And then this relationship in different climatic regions, arid regions compared to humid regions. And then this relationship, the contribution of topsoil thickness to the GPP compared to other environmental controlling factors such as heat, water, availability, and nutrients in the soil. So to study the three questions here, we use long-term average GPP and climate data. And eventually, we also wanted to study this relationship in the context of climate change and ecosystem resilience. To study this, we use annual GPP and annual climate data. So again, we use a legacy dataset, 2,400 panels collected by USDA. And that's a smaller dataset compared to the previous study because we have to control for some other factors. And this is the topsoil dataset distribution from 86 to 2021. Because we have to match this data with the Landsat GPP. That's why we removed lots of topsoil datasets. And for the GPP data, in the paper we compared 3 GPP products. But today I just want to, we only have time to present the Landsat GPP. And we use the annual GPP data and long-term average data. For the land use patterns, for the land use data set, we compared 2. And we also only kept the locations with constant land use. So if there's a land use change, like a forest converted to cropland or reforestation, we just remove the data points. We try to maintain the constant land use. And eventually, this data set gave us about 700 samples for the cropland, 800 for the forest, and a few hundred samples for grassland, pasture, and shrubland. Then we also downloaded climate data, the long-term paraclimate data related to the light, water, and heat. As I mentioned, we used the annual climate data to match with the annual GPP, but we also calculated the long-term average climate data. Then we calculated aridity index and split this one to arid regions and humid regions based on the aridity index. And we use another climate classification system. This way we can have the arid regions, but we also have the control of the temperature. So we have the temperate region and the cold region. So the first we evaluated the topsoil thickness and GPP relationship in different ecosystems. And this is just scatter plots of the topsoil depth in 5 ecosystems and the Landsat GPP in 5 ecosystems. Then we have the average data across all the samples and the average points within each ecosystem. So you can see the cropland generally has deeper topsoil. The mean value is 27 centimeters. Forest has shallower topsoil. The mean value is 15 centimeters. So this doesn't mean that cropland gives us better soil, and it's simply because the soil is very fertile and people use those soil for agricultural production. Then if we compare the topsoil thickness with the GPP data, we can see although the forest has relatively shallow topsoil, it has very high GPP or even the highest GPP. And then if we look at the shrubland and grasslands, here, their topsoil is relatively shallow, and their GPP values are also low. Then we plotted the GPP and topsoil relationship in a single linear relationship. The x is topsoil depth, the y is the Landsat GPP in 5 ecosystems. And you can see this, the green represents grassland, the orange represents the shrubland, and the other 3 lines represent cropland, forest, and pasture. So you can see a stronger positive correlation exists in the grassland and shrublands. Both represent drier regions, and a weak correlation was observed in the cropland, and no clear correlations in forest and pasture. And then we evaluated this relationship in different climatic regions. So here we have the arid region and humid region, and then the arid region, the temperate region, and then the cold region. So, there's also the simple relationship, the Landsat GPP versus the topsoil depths. You can see for the humid region, the GPP is generally higher. They are between 1,000 to 2,500. But for the arid region, they have lower GPP in general. But then the correlation between the topsoil depth and GPP was more evident in the arid regions, represented by this orange line. Then for every 10 centimeter increase in the topsoil thickness, the GPP increased by 114 grams carbon per square meter per year. Then if we look at this system, okay, you can see for the arid regions, the relationship becomes stronger, represented by this purple line. And then there's no relationship for the cold and temperate regions. So the correlation of topsoil depth and GPP was primarily associated with the water availability instead of the temperature. And this relationship was stronger in dry regions. Then we quantified the contribution of topsoil depths compared to the other environmental factors on the GPP data. We use structural equation models. The productivities are Y variable, and then these are the X variables, including the light, heat, water, fertility, and topsoil depth. And each of this that variable is represented by several variables. So we quantify the structural equation models for 5 ecosystems and also for the 5 climatic regions. And this only shows the results of the 5 ecosystems. The reddish line and then the negative values represent negative contribution. And then the blue line and the positive value represents the positive contribution. So lots of numbers here, but generally, the topsoil's contribution is around 0.09 to 0.33. This is lower than the contribution from water. So water contribution can go up to 0.87. But then if you compare to the topsoil and heat, the contribution from heat, they are quite similar. Then if you look at the light and the soil fertility contribution, they're even smaller. So we did a rank. Generally, the contribution on the GPP, the water is the strongest contribution or controlling factor, and greater than topsoil, which is similar to the effect from heat. And then these effects are greater than the light and fertility. So the last part of this study, we quantified the effects of topsoil depth on the climate resilience of the GPP, because we know that GPP is not constant with years, and they actually vary significantly throughout the year, and or even across different years. This is just a random location I selected within the US and plotted the long-term GPP pattern from the 86 to 2021, and you can see how much it fluctuates. The lowest number is around here, and it is roughly 750. And the highest value is somewhere here, is 1,750. So it doubles for the highest value compared to the lowest value. And we know that precipitation is also changing with time. Temperature is also changing with time. So if you look at the precipitation, the smallest value is 400 millimeters, and then the largest value is almost 1,000. It just changes significantly at different times. And then for the temperature, it has an increasing pattern generally for the past almost 40 years. But it also fluctuates a lot. The lowest value is almost 12, fluctuates from 12 to 15 degrees Celsius. So if we only look at the average GPP and the climate information, we just lose lots of details. So the question we want to answer here is, how does the topsoil depth affect this fluctuation? So this is our hypothesis. If we have shallower topsoil, it can fluctuate significantly for the GPP or productivity. However, if we have deeper topsoil, it's more resilient, so the fluctuation is smaller. So basically, if the topsoil is deeper, ecosystem productivity is more stable, and hence the percent change of GPP is smaller, or closer to zero. Because later we calculated the percent change of the GPP with time. So that's what we calculated. We identified dry extreme is the year received the lowest precipitation. So this figure shows the GPP fluctuation with time, and this figure represents the precipitation fluctuation with time. We selected the driest year, or we call it dry extreme, and calculated the percent change in GPP and precipitation in the dry year compared to the 36-year average data. So basically, the GPP of the driest year minus the average GPP divided by the average GPP to calculate the percent change in this dry year. And we also calculated the wet extremes, just the wettest year, and hot and cold extremes to see how stable the GPP patterns are under these extreme conditions. So we plotted this pattern for different extremes. This only represents the dry year and wet years. And yes, we also have figures for the hot and cold years. And we studied this relationship in 5 ecosystems: cropland, forest, grassland, pasture, and shrubland. We also split them by regions, the arid region and humid regions, because they behave differently. And then, as you can see, so the y-axis is the percent change of the Landsat GPP under these extreme conditions. The x-axis is the topsoil depth. So we found in these 2 regions specifically, the grassland and shrubland in arid regions, they form an interesting pattern, which is very clear here, a triangle pattern. So this means, I covered some of the text, in grassland and shrubland in arid regions, the percent change of GPP was closer to zero, and the productivity was more stable when the topsoil is deeper, because here is the shallower topsoil, and if we move along the x-axis, we get deeper topsoil. And once we get deeper topsoil, this fluctuation becomes smaller, and this change becomes is closer to zero. And this pattern is observed for these 2 conditions only: the grassland, shrubland, and also in arid regions. For some other regions, we see slightly pattern, but it's not as strong as these 2 regions. So we made a summary that we ranked the 5 ecosystems according to their precipitation levels, and shrubland receives the lowest amount of rainfall, followed by the grassland. However, in pasture and forest, they receive lots of water. Then in drier regions, the topsoil really plays an impact on the productivity. And if we have deeper topsoil, we have more crops or more productivity. And if we have shallower topsoil, the productivity gets smaller. And also in drier regions, the topsoil depth also controls or contributes for the resilience of the productivity. So for the take-home message, the topsoil depth acts as water storage memory and resilience capacity. So thickness is not just a simple property. It influences how the ecosystems respond to drought, heat, and climate variability. Okay, that's plenty of almost 40 minutes already. Okay, then I will present some of my ongoing projects and future directions. So as I mentioned, what my lab is doing, basically we are compiling lots of legacy samples, soil archives, and combine this archive data to modern technologies like lab-based sensing technologies, field-based sensing technologies, even remote sensing, and to create scalable soil monitoring. And then from this scalable soil monitoring information, we try to use it for knowledge discovery on the soil environment and human interactions. And here's an example of what sensor data we are using. There's lab-based sensing data and ground-based sensing and proximal and remote sensing. These provide us lots of information or help us get lots of soil information more easily compared to the traditional field-based sampling and laboratory analysis. And I also published lots of papers how to improve the soil data generation based on different sensing technologies in the lab and also in the fields by combining with proximal and remote sensing data. So that's one project we're currently working on is developing the nationwide soil property estimation tool using an infrared spectral library. And it involves lots of modeling work, machine learning models, and even eventually a web-based application. But the goal is to enhance our ability to generate lots of soil data. And this soil data will help us understand how the ecosystem functions. The second, once we have the lots of data generated from different sensors or technologies, the second goal is to use the data for knowledge discovery to understand soil, environment, human relationships. There are two ongoing projects. On the left one, we are studying a very unique soil type, which is called andisols. And they are formed from volcanic ash, and they're basically concentrated in this region. And they have very high organic matter concentration, and they are very fragile and also very fragile to the wildfire disturbance in this region. So we use mid-infrared spectra to generate lots of new data sets because they're just very difficult to collect samples and to measure their properties in the lab. And from these data sets, we try to improve our understanding of the soil formation properties and processes, and even their disturbance, potential disturbance from the wildfire or other factors. And then this is another ongoing project related to agriculture, soils. And we are combining soil mapping and data process-based modeling to understand how management practices, including cover crop, tillage, and drainage, affects the carbon dynamics. Yes, that's all. So basically, this is a summary of what we do. Combining different technologies, sensing technologies and modeling approach to generate new data and improve our current modeling approaches, and eventually use this information to help us improve the understanding. That's all. Thank you.
Great, thank you very much. Thank you for the nice talk. Happy to take any questions.
Hi, nice talk. I had a basic question on why is soil thickness shallower over the arid regions? Is it because there's more wind erosion, or is it because there are less plants to break down the bedrock?
Yeah, that's a good question. Because as I mentioned, when we look at one property, no matter carbon or thickness, we consider the input and output. In arid regions, the input is actually smaller because the weathering is slow in arid regions. If you want to increase the weathering, you have to have water. So the water will dissolve lots of stuff in the rocks. And also in relatively wetter regions, there's more vegetation growing. The rooting depths and rooting density can also help break down the rocks to increase the weathering intensity. So in arid regions, both activities are lacking. That's why the input is smaller. And wind erosion is another reason that causes soil loss in arid regions.
Maybe I'll ask a question. So on the first part of the presentation, I want to see if I understood this right. So in general, looking across the Midwest and maybe Wisconsin, you've seen recently, or at least since the 80s, some increase in carbon content in the soils. And first question is, can we assume that that's continued? It went through like 2002. So maybe over the last 20 years, has that maybe also continued?
Based on this study, we don't have the data for the past 20 years. I will have to look at if the USDA collected more data for the past 20 years.
Okay.
And so that's not.
That's fine. That's fine. But generally increasing carbon in the recent past, right? But then maybe a decrease in soil thickness in the Midwest as well.
Yeah.
So is that true that we're having increasing carbon, but we're having decreasing soil thickness?
They may not happen at the same location.
Okay.
Yeah.
Would you expect them to happen? I mean, generally when we look at a map, it kind of looks like that could be true, but I was having a little trouble understanding if that was actually true or not.
Yeah, generally if we consider we are losing soil, especially topsoil, we're actually losing carbon as well, because that's where the carbon is mostly stored.
Right.
And but then the topsoil is actually moved to the lower part of the landscape, so probably the lower part of the landscape is gaining more carbon, but there's a balance. If we look at larger scale, it tells us probably slightly different information than if we look at a smaller landscape scale.
Right. Okay, so these could be very proximal to each other.
Yeah.
That's helpful, thank you.
Yes.
Great talk. In part one, when you saw the high resolution map from the random forest model, so am I understanding it right that it's trained by the in situ data and then you generate a map for the whole state?
Yes, so it's trained by the 550 ground truth data. And once the relationship was built, and we extrapolated to the whole state.
Okay, so to follow up on that, do you have, in AI, do you have sensitivity tests on, how do you know how much sample makes the result reliable and robust?
Yeah, that's a good question. So our study, at least this study is limited by how many legacy samples we can get from the archive library. And then in the study, we only have 550 samples. Definitely, if we have more samples, it can probably give us better representation of the whole state. But it's just limited by the number of samples we have.
Can I ask a follow-up on that? So in your model process, do you drop some of the samples that you do have and then try to reproduce those so you can evaluate how well your model's performing? Or are you just using it to extrapolate to areas where you don't actually have samples?
Yeah, we split so we have 550 samples. We split the data into calibration and validation. So we have independent evaluation on how the model performance. But eventually for the mapping parts, we don't have other samples to verify. Yeah.
Okay, thanks. Any other questions?
Yes.
So on page 16, there's a picture shows like the thickness of the topsoil and soil, and on the East Coast, the topsoil seems to be like deeper in the East Coast, but the soil seems to be thinner. Is there
Yeah.
explanation for that? Like just the temperature?
Yeah, I need to remember what we did. Yes.
16.
This is 15. This is 16.
So the soil kind of like drops.
Yeah, the soil dropped here, but for the topsoil, it increased here. But this data actually is calculated from this map. So can you see here? So for the topsoil, so we average the values for each degree along the longitude. And then the soil is like, for the soil is thicker here, as you can see from the bluish color, and it drops for the northeastern part because these are mostly forested lands and also cold regions. So there are multiple factors affecting this longitudinal pattern. So it's cold region and also forested land. They are just shallower here. But for here, the pattern is not that strong. There's slightly decreasing for the topsoil, but the pattern is not as strong as here.
So it's because like the average cost.
Yeah, the average causes some of the.
Another question about so it's in the topsoil is makes the productivity more resilience under dry condition because it can reserve water. So if the soil becomes like if it's a sandy condition, will this still stand? Like is it still like making the dry condition more resilient like dry activity?
Yeah. Yes, we didn't split the soil by the soil types, clay soil or sandy soil, but clay soil definitely stores more water. So under like more extreme conditions, they can provide more water for the vegetation. But even for sandy soil, if you have slightly higher organic matter content, the probably stores slightly more water, which will help for the vegetation.
Okay, let's thank our speaker, Yakun Zhang.